Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. We are going to go ahead and get started here in just a moment. We're waiting for a few more folks to log on. We have had an incredible turnout for this webinar and are excited to be with you as we kick off our School Safety Thursdays. In the next couple of minutes, I'd like to give you an opportunity to use the question panel there on the right-hand side of your screen to gather and to share any questions that you may have about immunizations in general, about the changes in law, and frankly, about anything else that is school safety related. And so we're going to, like I said, allow just a few more people to join us. And in the meantime, please feel free to share any questions that you may have, and we'll get started in about a minute and a half. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today in the first webinar in our school safety series. We're excited today to be talking about the immunization law changes, and today we're really going to focus on what we need to do, what we might want to do, and how we communicate. And we're excited to be able to be with you as we kick off the series, which will actually begin to, or I should say will continue to run every Thursday at 10 a.m. Pacific. And so if you have time and are able to join us, we'd love to be able to see you on some, if not all, of the webinars that we do throughout this school year. Before I get started, I'd like to welcome everyone back from summer vacation. We, as a safety consulting team, work throughout the summer. And it's always interesting that from about June 25th until August 3rd, or that first Monday in August, our phones seem to be nice and quiet. We get some good catch-up done, and everything's nice and easy. And then all of a sudden, that first Monday in August, and for us that was this week, the phones get flooded and everybody is back. And so for those of you that were able to take some time off, we appreciate that you are back with us and with us so soon after you get back. For those of you that weren't, hopefully you'll find some time later on this year. But nonetheless, welcome back, and here's to a great school year. Today we're going to be talking, as I mentioned, about the law changes related to immunizations. And for those of you who are familiar with these law changes, we're going to do a little bit of review first. So even if you've watched the news and seen a lot of the media and attention that's been focused on this, you may not know exactly how this situation came to be. And what I mean by this situation is this whole PBE, which is personal belief exemption versus not, the whole immunization versus not, etc. And so as we go through the material today, hopefully even those of you that are incredibly familiar with the law and how it affects you at either a public or private school still learn something, if nothing else, about how we got to this situation. Now, just so that I can get a quick understanding of how everybody is doing and where you're coming from in terms of your knowledge, we're going to launch a poll question. And the question that I'd like to ask each of you is, how well do you understand the immunization law changes that have taken place here in California, and what's expected of your school now? And so I'll give you just a second. The poll will populate on the right-hand side of your screen. And again, the question is, how well do you understand the immunization law changes that have taken place in California, and what's expected of your school now? And we'll go ahead and get that launched for you. And there it is on your screen in front of you. So go ahead and take a moment. Oh, let's see here. All right, it looks like there may be some technical difficulties going on with the poll question, so we'll go ahead and move past it. If you're able to see the screen in front of you, which you should, it shares with you what your options were. Many of you fall within one of these categories very clearly, and some of you may fall within the categories or between the categories. What the law changed, that tends to be one that a lot of us fall into. Albeit it's a law that's gotten a lot of media attention, it is something that is not well communicated and certainly not well understood by those of us that don't get to practice and deal with these types of issues on a daily basis. And so many of you may fall into that category. Many of you also may fall into the category there at the bottom. I know so much that we should really have you leading this webinar. But for those of you that fall anywhere in between, this will be the most impactful. And we're excited to be able to share this with you. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and put some of this into context. So the state of California has selected a handful of immunizations that each child in a school should receive. What that means is that the state of California has said these immunizations, and we'll talk about specifically what those are here in just a moment, must be given to any child who attends, and in all fairness, the law specifically applies to preschools and ECCs, daycares, K-12 schools, and post-secondary schools. I'll share with you a list in just a moment that is specifically extracted from the law, but really these are the groups and the core audiences that this law applies to. Now, most of you will fall into the K-12 school category. Some of you that fall into the K-12 school category will have an ECC and a preschool. Regardless, you are going to fall into this. Now, I'm seeing the question come in now, and I anticipated it would. Well, what about those of us that are at a private or an independent school? And the law applies to you too. And one of the challenges that many of us in the private and independent school world have had is understanding specifically how this law translates from school or institution or sort of state mandate to us at our school, and what controls, if any, we have. And that's certainly something that we're going to talk about today. Now, the problem. So let's start with some history and some real context for you. On February 28th of 1998, a physician named Dr. Wakefield, a British physician actually, published a paper in The Lancet, which is a UK medical publication essentially. And it described 8 children whose first symptoms of autism appeared within about 1 month of receiving the MMR vaccine. For those of you that don't do this all the time, an MMR vaccine is a measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. And so essentially, 8 children out of a small handful developed these symptoms, and he decided that that was autism, or rather that that was a cause for the autism that developed thereafter. Now, vaccination rates, as soon as this publication appeared in the UK and in the US, plummeted. At this point, and what's interesting and frightening perhaps, is that last year, and I'm not talking about last year as in 1997, I'm talking about last year as in 2014, 1/3 of the parents in the United States believe that children between, and I'm sorry, that actually is populating interestingly on the poll question in front of you. 1/3 of the parents, rather, with children under the age of 18 believed that immunizations were probably dangerous for their students or for their children. Just under that believed that they caused autism. And so if you take 1/3 of the entire population and you assume that that group really feels and is afraid of immunizations in general, and you take the bulk of that population that is afraid and you assign a very specific and tangible fear to it, like autism, that can be really terrifying, and in fact that can be really detrimental to the overall immunization rates. Now, then we had somebody get on board, and I'm calling Jenny McCarthy out because she was one of the people who spearheaded the sort of US fight or push or discussion on this immunization and autism law, or thought, and she is one of very, very many celebrities and others, non-celebrities included, that were very, I'll say, much in support of the idea that immunizations may cause autism. Now, this all started in 1998. This all has continued to today. The challenge is that and I'll say the challenge with the study, and then I'll also say that the challenge in general, is that the study led basically the entire group, or the entire science group that was putting together the paper, into an interesting set of controls. Essentially what happened was they didn't allow a control group, which is a necessity in any sort of experiment. And because they didn't allow a control group, there was no way for them to appropriately or correctly analyze what the actual ratio or percentage of students or children that developed autism was versus those who didn't receive the immunization. Now, there's a thought and a theory that somewhere around 50,000 British children per month received the MMR. And at that point, at the age of somewhere between 1 and 2 is where we begin, especially at that time where we began to see autism develop. And the challenge is that if 50,000 children a month get it, and 8 children get autism at a time that is very likely for them to get autism, there's not a way for us to tie those together unless there is. And sure enough, the paper was essentially redacted, and there's not a way for us to tie these things together. Now, the paper was redacted for a handful of reasons. There's talk about financial ties to the immunization manufacturers, meaning that perhaps Dr. Wakefield or a group of people, or the group of people that was on his team, was somehow or another tied to the pharmaceutical companies that were creating the MMR vaccine. The biggest challenge is that the experiment actually violated the current thought on scientific experiments, and it removed or didn't use control subjects. And then what we've found over the course of the last 15 to 17 years is that the theory is not logical and doesn't make sense. Dozens of scientists worldwide have actually been able to confer and determine that the law, or rather the thought process, did not make sense, did not come through. Now, the challenge for us is that although scientists were able to figure this out, and although since about 2000 we've been very clear about the fact that this paper and this study and hypothesis was incorrect and frankly invalid, unfortunately the rest of the world was already informed at that point, and the media, the news, and everyone frankly had access to a different type of media that began in 2000, well, right around there, which was the internet. And so information, word, and rumors for that matter could travel that much more quickly. Now, fast forward about 15 years. Measles, a disease that had essentially been eradicated in the US, came back. Between January 1st and February 21st of just this year, about 121 cases were found. Many of you remember this. I certainly do, and I'll share with you exactly why here in just a moment. But essentially, the outbreak was believed to have begun or started in Anaheim, which is in Southern California, for those of you that aren't familiar with it. And it was believed to be started by somebody who did not have a measles vaccine, was exposed to measles, and then promptly exposed other people to it. Now again, 121 cases diagnosed in just under 45 days. We as a community, we as a state, we as an independent, public, private, and otherwise school community had to respond. I'll talk briefly about the PBE in just a moment. Now, I want to take just a second, and for those of you who had or didn't understand the background or how we came to be at this point, if the few slides and the few moments that we've taken to talk about the history of immunizations and how everybody began to be afraid of immunizations would be helpful for you, and or if you feel like sharing some of the policy and the law with your parent audience would be helpful for you, please feel free to take a moment and fill out the poll, and we'll see if we can get the poll to correctly display on your screen. And sure enough, there it is. So just keep an eye out on your screen. And what I'll ask you to do is go ahead and select one of the following. Yes, I would love for us, Jossie, to go ahead and invite your parents to a webinar just like this. No, I think this would either make it too complex or otherwise just not be helpful. And maybe, let's see how the rest of the webinar goes. And I'll give you about 30 seconds here to go ahead and vote, and then we'll share those responses with you. As you guys are voting, I'm just going to share with you that I'm seeing some really great questions come in. We are definitely going to talk about these. It looks like the primary challenges or questions that you are having are how immunizations relate to private schools. So for those of you that are either new and or existing private or independent schools, you're concerned about how this relates and translates over to you, and that is certainly something we're going to continue to discuss. And there are a couple of questions that we'll specifically call out throughout here. And I'll give you about 10 more seconds to complete that poll. All right, and I'll go ahead and close it out for you. So thank you so much. It looks like about half of you feel like it would be helpful to have a presentation like this. About a third of you or so decided maybe, and the balance said no, we've got it under control. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. Now I'll jump into a quick personal story. So in January of 2015, as I mentioned, we had 121 cases of measles, and we had a term, and that is the term outbreak, that was being used by schools, by individuals, by news media outlets far and wide. And we had what was one of the most interesting and challenging months as a team of safety consultants who respond to and support schools as they manage situations like this. And what I found was that the level of panic that immediately was found in our parent groups, whether it be in Southern California or Northern California or in states in other parts of the country, was incredible. I've never seen it happen so quickly. The term outbreak was consistently used by the news media, and I believe that had a lot to do with it. I found something else that I found to be really interesting, and we haven't spoken yet a lot about PBEs, so if you're not comfortable with that term or what that is, bear with us and I'll explain it for you in just a moment. But what I found was sort of what I almost want to compare to a witch hunt that occurred within parent audiences, where in a single grade or a group of either an elementary school, a high school, sometimes even an ECC, would attempt to find out what students in that group had not been immunized and attempt to pressure and convince and do all but literally force the parents of those students who had not yet been immunized to be immunized or to have their children immunized. And I found that on top of all of that, there were publications that were being put out and shared, and many of you were exposed to those. Many of you perhaps even were in those, where whether it was the LA Times or the Hollywood Reporter was publicly reporting the PBE statistics or the number of students that were at our campus that had not yet been immunized for one reason or another. And what I found in all of that was that there were two key problems. And the first was that as schools, we didn't have the infrastructure from the government to support ourselves to say, hey, there's a good reason that the bulk of our students or a handful of our students or whatever that number is, or was, I should say, is exempt from immunization. We just didn't have the infrastructure or the backbone or the support that we needed to be able to say, here are the facts and here is why. Instead, what happened was we had a relatively loose law, and using that law, we tried to adhere to policy and we tried to understand what we needed to do, but we were pretty blindsided by the outbreak and by the really, really quick panic that came from parents. And then we also had a challenge because, especially for those of you that are private or independent school organizations, we had the added challenge of trying to figure out, well, if this is the state law for a public school, does it or does it not apply to me? And if so, or if not, I should say, if I don't allow a student to come to my school who is not immunized for one reason or another, is that considered discrimination? And so we really had these two pretty key issues. Number one, how do I deal with it if I don't have anything to lean on or any sort of infrastructure to use to support my case or my stance? And number two, am I going to violate other laws by trying to pick and choose what students I accept or what students stay on campus and at school, or could that be considered discrimination? So we'll fast forward even a little bit further. June 30th of 2015, the governor of California signed off on a bill that changed the law for all. The law now says that children must be immunized against the diseases on your screen. Incidentally, the law said before that children must be immunized against the diseases on your screen. I'll let you take a moment to look those over. And as you do, I'll share with you that it does not matter who immunizes your children or your family's children. It matters that they are an approved provider. Essentially, that means that they have a certification or a license to do so. And it matters that they are operating within or in accordance with regulations. And basically, the regulations are a CDC compliance metric. And those regulations are going to be upheld by any pediatrician's office in the state of California. You can let your families know that if they'd like to, they have the right to ask for documentation of licensure as well as documentation of authorization for immunization. And that's a lot of really weird words, but basically what that means is they can say to the doctor, hey, show me your license and prove to me that you're a doctor. That's easy enough. And then they can also say to the pediatrician, show me the fact that you are authorized to actually give this immunization. Now, authorization or who can and can't give immunizations, that hasn't really been at the root or at the core of this issue. What really has been something called a PBE. And a PBE is a personal belief exemption. And up until this law changed, essentially, a PBE was able to be obtained for one of three reasons. The first is a medical reason, meaning that a student wasn't able to medically receive a medication or an immunization. Students that might have applied to, anybody that had HIV who couldn't receive a live immunization, students who were a little bit slower to develop, whether physically or emotionally rather, or cognitively, occasionally would be considered students who would be withheld for medical reasons. Any student who had any sort of challenge at birth would oftentimes have a little bit of a delay in immunizations. Students with Crohn's disease oftentimes would have a delay in immunizations. And so there are all of these different medical reasons to either have a delay or to withhold medications altogether, immunizations altogether. The next category was religious. So students whose families believed that for religious purposes it wasn't appropriate to get an immunization. And the third category was what I call students whose families believed that they just didn't want to, and it was essentially an optional field that a family could choose and say, you know what, I just don't want to, and here's why, and thanks so much. Now, the challenge with that, and that again is why I say that we didn't have the infrastructure to really support our stance or our numbers when it came down to it, because what we had to do is say, well, you know, we have X number of students that are PBE or that are considered exempt from actually receiving this medication, and we can't disclose of those X number how many are medical versus how many are religious versus how many just don't want to. And the quick judgment or quick decision by many of the folks that were reviewing those numbers is that the medical side was probably the minority and the religious and I don't want to side was probably the majority. And whether or not that's true, that can be a very quick moving concern and a very escalating challenge for you to have to deal with. Now, again, the law changed on June 30th, and the law now says, as it did before, that students must be immunized against the diseases on your screen. The law applies to all schools, child care centers, day nurseries or daycares, nursery schools, family daycare homes for students with special needs, development centers, any organization that has children that is not considered a one-day religious school at this point is going to be required to adhere to these new guidelines or to this new law, really. And again, if you're a one-day religious school, if you have a class after church on Sunday, a class after synagogue, or during the day on Saturdays or on Tuesdays, you may be exempt from this law. And I would recommend that you, number one, check with a lawyer, and number two, check with us to see if we can really make sure that you are truly exempt. Everybody else that is on this webinar, in fact, the bulk of you that are on this webinar, do not have that apply to you, although some of you, it looks like, may have that component along with your school. And as I look through, I don't see anybody who it looks to me like would fall under this category. Again, if you do or you feel you do, the first step is to check with a lawyer and allow them to take a look at the law, make sure that you're correct, and then the second thing to do would be to give us a call and have us take a look at it with you and do the same. Now, if this applies to everyone, and I told you earlier that this list of immunizations is not negotiable, it's this entire list, well, what about people who still can't take the medication? What about that medical category, that first category that we talked about? There are two things that go on with the medical category. The first is that if a student is medically cleared by a physician to not receive the medication, if they're medically cleared to not receive the immunization for one reason or another, they're still okay. The second, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second, the second is that a student who before January 1st, 2016 submits a PBE and says to you, being the school, that they are exempt from immunization, whether it's for religious, medical, or the third category reasons, you are actually required to honor that PBE until the end of the grade span for that student. Put differently, if the student's in first grade, you are required to honor that PBE until the student goes to middle school. If the student's in the ECC, you're required to honor that PBE until the student goes to elementary school. For the purposes of this subdivision, which is just fancy words for that little paragraph from the law, the grade span means birth to preschool, kindergarten, and elementary school, essentially, and then grades 7 through 12. So once they go on to junior high, they sort of fall into the same category from that point forward. But again, if they're a toddler in a program, let's say they're 2 years old, you're required to honor a PBE if submitted before January 1st, 2016 until they move up to kindergarten. If they're a kindergartner this year and they submit a PBE before January 1st, 2016, you're required to honor that PBE for several years until they go on and into middle school. And if they're in elementary school now, you're required to honor that PBE until they go on to, or rather, if they're in middle school now, you're required to honor that PBE until they essentially go on to post-secondary. So if you're required to honor these PBEs for such a long period of time, especially if they're in middle school or in elementary school where you're talking about 5 or 7 years, then would it make sense to just have everybody that wants to fill out a PBE fill that PBE out right now, submit it before January 1st, and then have you as a school honor it? Well, the answer is no. In fact, every school is required to have that PBE be signed in the 6 months prior to the beginning of the school year. So if your school year starts in September, as many of them do, you are required for that PBE to be signed by or before or after March 1st or March X date, depending on what the first day of your school year is. So put differently, if everybody were to go out and sign a PBE before January 1st, let's say in December, that PBE would essentially expire come June of the very next year. And so it wouldn't qualify for a student not to have immunizations for the following year. So, well, I still don't feel comfortable with that. If a student can be exempt from immunizations for such a long period of time, then isn't everybody at risk? Isn't that still a challenge? And for some of you, the answer will be yes, because you'll have a large population of students that are PBE at this point and that will remain PBE for the next several years and onto and into the next grade span. For those of you that have a large number of PBE students, there are really two things that you can do, and there are two ways that you can empower your community or support your community. And I categorize those two things as education and empowerment because that's really all that we can do from the school's perspective. We can educate our parents on the value and the benefits of immunizations, although many of our parents already know that. We can perhaps more powerfully educate our parents on the fact that the paper or the experiment and hypothesis that essentially started the challenge years and years ago has been pulled back, is no longer considered valid. We can educate our parents on exactly how to go about getting immunizations and what the best ways are to do so safely. And ultimately, we can educate our parents on the fact that immunizing their own child protects their child and protects the other students at our school. we can empower them by giving them resources, third-party resources, whether they be audience-style seating and speaking from somebody like your nurse, or bringing somebody in from an autism organization that would actually combat the theory just as well as anybody else would at this point, or bringing in a physician who could speak to the value and benefits of actually immunizing and help your parents really understand the value and the need for immunizations in general. But these are the ways that you can educate, you can empower, you can manage the concern about immunization. Some things that you can't do are force your parents to go out and get immunized. Now, I say that, and just as I do, I'll qualify it with unless they have a PBE. Because if you have a group of parents who has a PBE on hand, it is for a medical reason, it is valid and considered completed within the 6 months prior to the start of the school year, there's nothing you can do, and frankly, there's nothing you need to do. That student is truly medically cleared from immunizations and therefore will not be able to have them, at least this year. And or that student has been delayed and will not have them until their doctor or physician decides that they need them. On the flip side, if you have a group of kids who does not have that PBE medical and you're starting next school year, that group of parents is, for better or worse, going to need to go out and have that either get the PBE or get the immunization, and the physicians will really make the decision about what they do. Now, I talked about that medical exemption, and let's take just a moment to really dive into it. So the medical exemption is essentially allowed when a parent files with the school a PBE, which is still a very comparable form as it was last year or the year prior. And the parent files the form and says to the school, as a result of my doctor's evaluation, my student is not medically cleared to be immunized for one reason or another. It's not our concern, business, or listed on the PBE necessarily why they're not allowed or able or willing to be immunized. That's up to the physician to determine whether it's necessary to disclose or not, and most of the time they will not, and that's okay. But so long as you have a valid physician signature on the PBE and you filled out the PBE form correctly, you're going to be entirely okay. If you have not, on the other hand, verified that you have actually seen the physician signature and seen the rest of the form and made sure that it is all correct, you are not going to be okay. Now, at the end of September, for most of you, you begin to prepare a document that gets submitted to the state. And you submit that document if you're an ECC, you submit that document if you have a kindergarten, and you submit that document if you have a 7th grade. If you have new students, you may also submit that document depending on what grades they're in and what county you're in. That said, on that document, historically, you've been asked to articulate what type of PBEs you received. And again, that's type as in religious, medical, or other, not type as in medical because of X. So historically, we were able to say medical, religious, or other. Historically, you've been able to say the number of students. In fact, you've been required to say the number of students that had a PBE in total and the number of students that you had in total in those various programs. So again, ECC, kindergarten, and 7th grade. That process will remain the same. For those of you that use the website shotsforschool.org, which is the site that most of you ought to be using, that will remain the same. The only difference will be that when we get into next school year, that those religious and other exemptions will disappear, and that when you go to submit or you go to file, you will be required to articulate just the fact that you have medical exemptions and just the fact that those exemptions exist and that you have verified that the PBE form is on file. Now, again, some students who you might expect to find a PBE for are those with highly special needs, those with a severe, or potentially even life-threatening childhood illness, children who had an incident at birth of a handful of different types, but that may be delayed in their process in terms of receiving their immunizations, children with HIV who can't receive live immunizations, children with childhood cancer who may not be able to receive immunizations. So there are a handful of different types of students that will fall into this category that can't receive immunizations. And the next question that I'm often asked is, well, is it possible that a physician would sign off when indeed it wasn't actually a medical reason, it was just that the family chose or didn't want to be immunized? And the answer to that question is, it's absolutely possible. For better or for worse, we cannot control what our physicians will do. And when I say we, I'm really talking about the larger community, not our own physicians here at Jaffe. But the larger community of medical science and in fact the entire profession can do as much as we can to monitor and to try and prevent that. But inevitably, some will fall through the cracks, and some physicians will sign off on an immunization PBE that is not really appropriate. That's not our job or our area as a school to investigate, to know, or to really be bothered with. And it's also not our responsibility to verify that there's a legitimate medical reason behind the PBE. It's our job as a school to verify that there's a legitimate physician signature on the PBE, and it's our job as a school to verify that the rest of the PBE form has been completed correctly. But that's the extent of what we are asked and required to do as a school, no matter what age group we work with. And so for better or for worse, although certainly it is possible that one or another physician might not do exactly what they've been asked to do and sign off on a PBE that perhaps is not the most appropriate to sign off on, it's important to remember that certainly it's a possibility, and certainly that can happen, and as I said, inevitably will happen, and it's not our responsibility, our job, or our need to monitor or to try and prevent that. So what I'd like to do is just pause for just a second to answer a couple of the questions that have come in, and there's been some really great ones. The first one that I'm going to answer and I'm reading through some of these that are really great. In fact, what I'll do is I see the first question here is where do I get a copy of an official PBE? And what I'll have you do, it looks like that came from Nancy. Nancy, what you can do, and anybody else who has a similar challenge or question, is go to the website shotsforschool.org, and it'll be shots, S-H-O-T-S, and I'll actually type that into the message panel here for you, forschool.org. And if you go to that website, you can actually download a copy of a live PBE form, and that is going to be the website that you'll want to go back to on an annual basis, because as you change, or rather as the PBE changes, laws change, policies change, exactly what needs to happen changes, forms change for that matter. You'll always find the latest copy there. So shotsforschool.org, and then you can find a copy of the PBE there. The next question that I see here is who do they submit a PBE to? And Cynthia, that's a great question. So the PBE actually is turned into whoever it is at your school campus that collects the health records and the immunization records. So for most school campuses, it's either a nurse or a registrar. Obviously, there are some schools where that's different. I have one school where a coach collects medical and health information. I have another where an office manager does. So regardless of who does it on campus, it needs to be collected by the same person who collects all the rest of your information, and then that person is the one that will file and create that report that gets submitted at the end of September, beginning of October. Now, what's really important also to remember about these PBEs is that these are considered very, very restricted access, we'll say. They're confidential to a point. They're confidential also, though, within the administration. And so what that means is that although the nurse may know about the fact that they've got a student with a PBE, and although one or two other people on campus may know that, nobody else on campus should. And that includes all of the administration. And for some guidance on who on campus, on your specific campus, should be, let's say, in the know about what students have a PBE, the best thing to do would be to reach out to either your own lawyers, or you can reach out to us and we can connect you with a team. But every school runs a little bit differently, and based on the way that you're structured, you may have anywhere from 1 to 3 or 4 people on campus that would know specifically who on campus does have a PBE. But 4 is really going to be your limit for almost any school. No more than that should know which students specifically have a PBE. Now that begs the question, of course, well then how come everybody in the world has access to our total PBE count? And the reason for that is that when we submit for an ECC, for a kindergarten, or for a 7th grade class, that information is considered public information, and the Department of Public Health has access to it and then publicizes it because they're actually required to by law. When they publicize it, in fact, when we submit it, we restrict the names, or we redact the names, so that they're not aware of exactly what student has what. They don't know which of our students is PBE versus not. They don't know which of our students has 4 TDAPs versus 5. But they know that at the very least, that X number of % on campus have received immunizations versus X number of % that have not. So who do they submit a PBE to? The same person who collects the rest of their immunization and health forms. And incidentally, if you're still working on who on campus is supposed to collect your immunization and health forms, please feel free to let us know, and we'll be more than happy to help support you with that a little bit. The next question that I see on here is from Michelle. Michelle, your question was, what if the blue immunization card is signed and not a PBE as a child was enrolled prior to 2015? Do they now have to complete a PBE? So Michelle, the immunization card or any document that, that has immunizations on it, and in fact, on shotsforschool.org, you can actually find an immunization card, and or if you Google California immunization card, and you can Google either for elementary schools, for ECCs, for middle schools, or for high schools. But if you Google one of those, or you look at shotsforschool.org, you can get a copy of one of these immunization cards or immunization forms. For the ECC sector, or preschool sector that's on the line with us today, you are actually required to use the state form. For others, you have a little bit of flexibility, but not much. It's always best to just use the state form. The state form, though, will articulate on the form itself how many vaccines have been received, and then a physician will sign that to verify that that's true. Oftentimes, they'll also include a copy of the medical record with that form, and either way, if the student is missing even one of the forms, or one rather of the immunizations that they're expected or required to have, they must also submit a PBE. So although the physician's signing off on the blue card or on the immunization record, and it certainly would appear that they're in the know, that the student doesn't actually have all of the immunizations that are expected or required, it doesn't matter. They are still required to submit above and beyond that a PBE with that form to whoever on campus collects the health and safety information. Now, there are no exceptions to that rule, for better or for worse, but I do have some folks who have those turned in separately, and that's entirely fine. In fact, we have some folks that have PBEs come in only by secure fax, and other forms that come in only by drop-off. So you certainly can modify how you receive information to make the most sense for your campus. But in short, in spite of the fact that the physician may know, or you may think that it's clear that they would know based on the fact that they signed off on the immunization sheet, they are still required to submit a PBE that also must be signed by that physician. So great question. Thank you, Michelle. And Chanel, it looks like you've got a great question too. So where do we send the list of PBEs to after they are collected on campus? Good question, and you're not actually going to send a list. So what you're going to do is on shotsforschool.org, in fact, Chanel, what age group do you have on campus? I'll give you just a second to share that answer with me, and you can just put it in the question box there, and I'll catch it. 6th through 12th, excellent. So Chanel, for your 7th grade students, you're going to submit that on shotsforschool.org, and when you go to submit it, all you're going to submit is the total percentage of students that are immunized versus students that are not. So what you're going to do is you'll fill out a form, and that form is not open yet. In fact, you'll notice that if you go to try and fill it out now, you can't. It will probably open mid to late August, and then you'll begin to fill it out somewhere in mid to late September, and I'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. But for your 7th grade students, you'll log on to shotsforschool.org, you'll click on 7th grade, and then you'll report for your school. And when you report, you're only going to report percentages, not any names or anything like that. And you'll be able to report that, like I said, somewhere between mid to late September. Now, if I'm talking about reporting mid to late September, one of the challenges that often comes up is, well, don't I have students potentially on campus from the first day of school to mid-September who aren't immunized yet, and is that a compliance issue? And it is. The challenge for many of us at school is that we don't begin to collect forms or to collect information until later on in the school year, once the school year has really gotten started and kept going, and we've got a group of students that are here with us. But that group, and incidentally, in terms of timeline, in general, what I've found is that schools and families tend to have most of the paperwork in, let's say 70%, by the first week of school, by the end of the first week of school. The rest of that paperwork, the last 20 to 30%, tends to be the hardest paperwork to gather, and whether it's because of the family or because of the specific form or because of the process or the person on campus, it tends to take a really, really long time to get that paperwork. And so what we try to do is give you a little bit of time, and I say we, and I'm actually now referring to public health, but what they try to do is allow you a little bit of time to get everything in, collected, reported, and to make sure that you really understand what your student population looks like. And so the deadline is actually mid-October. I believe it's October 16th this year, to have all of that information submitted and reported. Now in our health aid program for the schools that we actually staff school nurses for, it's a requirement that we submit by October 5th. And we do that so that we have an opportunity to verify that the state has received the information, and we have an opportunity to answer any questions that they may have about the information before the deadline. Because once we hit the deadline, we're no longer able to go back and amend those reports. And if we hit the deadline and we have not yet submitted, or our information is considered incomplete, we're published on a list of schools that is considered incomplete and out of compliance schools. And that's certainly not a place that we want any of our schools to be. So consider that. My recommendation is always to file early and to always make sure that you verify that the state actually receives the information, and then go from there. And generally speaking, if you give yourself at least a week or so to do that, you're going to be in a good place. So thanks, Chanel. That was a great question. I'll answer one more question here. Let's see. I have some really good questions. Kristen, great question. So Kristen's question or thought was, I'd like to send an easy-to-read either email communication out to parents so that they could understand really what's going on. Now there are two places, Kristen, that you can access that. The first is if you go on to shotsforschool.org, there's a brochure or sort of a pamphlet that is relatively clear. It talks a little bit about immunizations, it explains what the requirements are, and it adds to your ability to help make your case. And then part two of that is that at the end of this webinar, we'll be sharing a document that will help you prepare your families for this change. And I'll talk a little bit about why I say prepare, even though it seems that it's happening right now. But you actually do have an opportunity to prepare your families for this change. So we'll prepare you to prepare your families by way of a template document that you're more than welcome to use and to distribute as needed. So great question, and certainly we can help you with that, and shotsforschool.org is another resource for you. So great questions that are coming in. They're still coming in. It looks like there are about 40 or so questions in the queue, which is excellent and incredible, and I'm going to keep answering them. I do want to make sure that we stay on time, so I'm going to jump back into the presentation and we'll just wrap up, and then I'll come back and answer questions. Incidentally, I will stick around after the end of the webinar today to continue to answer questions, and for any of you who have questions that linger or for whom I don't get to your questions right this moment, we'll follow up with you directly to make sure that we do get those answered for you, either after the webinar today or later on in the week. So jumping back in, the last thing we talked about was, well, when can we choose to, or rather when can families choose to exempt their students? And again, the only reason at this point that they can be exempt from immunization is if they have a medical reason and a physician's willing to sign off on it. Now, here's the fun part. What changes for this year? What does this actual timeline look like? Now, nothing changes immediately. In spite of the fact that the law was signed, or the bill was signed rather, that entered this into law, was signed on June 30th, nothing will actually take hold or take change quite yet. We have just a little bit of time to respond and react and prepare for this. This law will officially begin, if you will, on July 1st, 2016. So from now until July 1st, 2016, we have time to prepare, to educate, to empower, and to work with our families and make sure that they understand what's coming, they understand what's expected of them, and that they know exactly what they're supposed to do and how to be compliant, and of course, how to keep you compliant. After July 1st of 2016, this will be in full effect, and there will be no exception, no way around it, no way to work it. Now, between now and then, my recommendation is that we start with a nice email that goes out sometime between now and the start of the school year that articulates the policy, articulates exactly how we are going to respond to it, and then also offers parents an option and a place to go for more questions. If you don't have a school nurse especially, it's important to make sure that your families know where they can go to get questions answered. And for some of you, that resource may be Jaffe, it may be us. For others of you, that resource may be to send them to their own pediatricians. For others of you, it may be to send them to shotsforschool.org and let them see what you see. Really, the resources that you provide will depend on the type of challenges and concerns that you have. What I find is that in general, parents have a really, really strong concern one direction or the other. And so if you've got a parent group that is really, really opposed to this immunization law, perhaps the best thing would be to have them go talk with pediatricians and with Autism Speak or another autism group and see if they could talk a little bit about what specifically they need to be or they might not need to be concerned about. And if you have a group of parents who is very much for the immunization law, then you're probably in a little bit easier place in terms of what you have to do. You may just need to help them understand that it's not their job to control or to manage or to otherwise essentially discriminate against those families that choose not to be immunized. Now this year, if you have an ECC, a kindergarten, or a 7th grade, you will report as normal, and you will do so at shotsforschool.org. Again, nothing changes for this year. The first change, or the first date in terms of this timeline, well, of course, is June 30th when it was signed. But then in terms of the sequential sort of happenings, on January 1st will be the deadline for any PBE students to continue. So for any student who has a PBE that maybe is a transfer that happens early on in the year, those may get submitted before January 1st. Those are accepted, and those will remain intact through the end of the grade span. For anybody who submits a PBE after January 1st, remember it really won't matter if they submit it right away or submit it down the line, but really they should submit it somewhere after March or so that it's valid for next school year. But the only PBE that will work for them will be a medical reason. Next July, again, will only be medical exemption. Will apply to and for all of your students as they matriculate through the grades, and will, again, just in a little bit clearer language, disallow the exemptions that were previously in place. The other piece of this is that we want to really ensure that as we begin to conduct these School Safety Thursdays, that we are empowering you and we're providing you with as much information as possible, and we're really allowing and supporting you as you go back and try to work with your school. And so I'm going to share a poll question with you now, and I'm actually launching it, so you should see it on your screen there. Now that we've been through and we're on the other side of some of this, how well do you feel like you understand the immunization law changes that have taken place in California? And I'll give you about 30 seconds or so to answer. Excellent, and I will go ahead and close it out. I'll give you just another second or so to answer. Looks like some answers are still coming in. All right, and I'll go ahead and close it out. And so it looks like about half of you are feeling confident at this point, and about 20% or so of you are feeling like you know what's expected, and then the bulk of you are knowing a lot, and that's excellent. So I'm excited to hear that, and very happy to hear that. If you need some more, and I'll share just a couple of more things, and then I'm going to hop back into questions. I'm still seeing a bunch pop in here. If you need some more, you feel like you're not sure exactly what you're supposed to do or how to make this work for you and your community, we do consult with schools nationwide, in fact hundreds, to manage issues that are as simple, and I joke simple, but as simple as immunizations to as complex as large-scale emergencies that affect an entire campus or even neighborhood, and everything truly in between. And so if you're feeling confused and you're feeling like you need some more help and some more information about this, or you feel like you just need somebody to take it over for you, please feel free to click the link that's now being chatted out to you. It's also at the bottom of your screen. In fact, you can click it from your screen. Oop. Now you can click it from your screen. So please feel free to click that link and to sign up for essentially an assessment. And what we can do is get a better idea for who you are, who your community is, and what your needs really are. And based on that, then we can decide whether it might make sense for us to staff somebody like a health aide to manage this process entirely for you, or just to help you out by answering some of your questions. Again, and this is perhaps the most important thing said throughout the day today, we are not lawyers, and we don't pretend to be. So all of the things that we're talking about today are things that have been extracted from the law. They are, in fact, the law will be made available to you after this webinar so that you can take a look at it yourself. Although the PowerPoint and the conversation today has been reviewed by a legal team, it is not intended to be legal advice, and so we do want you to know that anything that you are going to do that is related to students, immunizations, or admissions should be reviewed by the lawyers that you either normally use, or if you need some, feel free to contact us, and we're happy to provide them for you. Now, that'll do it for our first event of the series. We're excited that you are with us today, and excited that you, again, so many of you turned out so quickly after you got back from summer to join us and to learn about immunizations. If you wouldn't mind filling out a quick survey by clicking the SurveyMonkey link at the top of your screen, this will help us as we continue to do these webinars and we continue to learn and understand what you feel like makes the most sense for you and what you feel like you need in terms of education. We want to make sure that we're giving you as much as we possibly can, but also not giving you too much. And so go ahead and click that link for us. Next, if you have any additional questions and you are not ready really for an assessment, but you just have some general questions that you want to ask, please feel free to email those to schools@joffeeemergencyservices.com. I skipped our bio at the beginning because I wanted to jump right in, but a little bit about us. We, for the last 8 years, have worked with hundreds of schools nationwide to do things as simple, as I said, as manage immunizations and provide CPR and first aid training, to as complex as staff a school nurse or somebody in the health office to manage this entire process for a school throughout the year. And so we do certainly have a good understanding for what's expected, and we also have quite a bit of real experience that we can share with you and do regularly share with our clients. So we're excited to be able to share that with you if you feel like you have the need. And finally, if you're interested in signing up for the entire series or for future webinars in this series, there's a link at the very bottom of your screen for a free webinar for next week. And again, this series will be taking place every Thursday at 10 a.m. and you'll be able to hear about things that will range from obviously our immunization discussion today to the EpiPen law changes from just over a year ago that many of you are still asking questions about throughout the year, and more. And so we are excited and hope to be able to share some of those with you as you continue to ask questions and continue to seek out more information. So with that, I will go ahead and hop back in. I'm going to answer just a couple of more questions. And by the way, it looks like a couple of you are having a hard time accessing the links we went ahead and chatted those out to you. So feel free to click those links in the chat pane there on the right-hand side of your screen. And again, those links, just as a reminder, we've got a SurveyMonkey link. We'd love all of you to fill out a SurveyMonkey so that we get a little bit more information about how you feel like we did and what we can continue to do better. There's an assessment link that will allow you to actually access somebody from our sales or consulting team so that you can learn a little bit more about what you need to be doing. And finally, the last link is a link to sign up for the rest of this series so that every Thursday at 10 a.m. that you have an opportunity to learn a little bit about school safety and some of the things that you may need to do. With that, I'm going to go ahead and take a look at a couple of more of these questions. And for those of you, incidentally, that need to wrap up before or as we hit the end of the hour, we're more than happy to follow up with you. Feel free to reach out to us. We'll continue to answer questions here for just a couple of more minutes. And again, as I said, we'll reach out to any of you that we did not get to answer questions for later on today or this week. For everybody, thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you on the next webinar. And with that, I'm looking through some of the questions here. And Shelley, you're more than welcome. It looks like Shelley's question we answered. Excellent. You're welcome, Kristen. Catherine, next year meaning 2016-17, correct. Yeah, so next school year it is what we're talking about. And I'm going to bump back up to the top. I'm actually going in reverse order at this point. Sue, great question. So Sue, you're fairly new as a high school registrar, and you've been looking for Tdap only. Do you need to be checking all immunizations, or was this already done in elementary and middle school? Sue, that's a great question, and it's kind of an interesting answer. You do indeed need to be checking for all immunizations, although it should have been done previously. So put differently, you definitely do need to look to see what's going on and look to make sure that all of your students are indeed compliant, but you should find very, very few, if any at all, students who are not currently compliant with anything aside from Tdap or an immunization that they might receive only in high school. So unfortunately, you do need to look for everything. Best case scenario, and more than likely, you may not find anything. So great question, Sue. Thank you. Catherine, great question number 2. If they do have a medical PBE and they need to be caught up on all shots, will they be granted a period of time to get them? So what's interesting about that is that if they currently have, or if they're currently delayed on shots, they will need to have a medical PBE in order to enter school. And it's just that simple. That's sort of the way that they've chosen to deal with it. So in order for them to enter school, they'll need a medical PBE because they are not considered compliant. They don't have the last several shots. For anybody who is delayed at the end of their catch-up period, they may actually remove their PBE or submit new documentation that says that they are immunized. But if they are currently delayed, they will still need a PBE, and the PBE will be the exact same it would be if they didn't have any at all. So great question. I think that does it. It looks like there's still about 30 or so questions in the queue, and what I'll do is somebody from our consulting team will reach out to you in the next several days to make sure that we answer these questions that are still there for you. And ensure that we can, like I said, make sure that we understand a little bit more about your community before we do so. So again, thank you to all of you that joined us today. I could not believe how great the turnout was, considering that you were all just getting back from school. So we really appreciate you being with us, and we hope to continue to see you on webinars in the future. Thank you so much, and have a great and safe school year. And for those of you who we see for CPR training in the next couple of weeks, we can't wait to see you. For those of you who will see for the first time for drills in September, we can't wait to see you either. So thank you all, and we look forward to talking with you soon. Bye-bye.